What is your sex ed horror story? 6th grade sex ed, at the end of the class. The teacher opened the floor for questions. She said we could ask anything as long as it was a serious question. The only question I remember is when a kid, male, asked, "It's okay to have sex with your sister, right? Dot." The teacher stared at him for what felt like a minute and said no. My sex ed teacher brought a kid up to the front of the classroom wearing a shirt that had 2 long sleeves and explained what an uncircumcised penis looked like. In 6th grade I learned the term popping your cherry from some friends in sex ed class. I went home with this newly found knowledge and accused my older sister of having her cherry popped. She broke out in tears and my mom grounded me for a week. 9th grade health with Mr. Lamb. Dude was an absolute gem of a human being. But his voice sounded exactly like Barry White. Like all the time. So anytime he tried to say anything remotely sexual, it sounded like the voiceover for a raunchy R&B song. Which made the freshmen erupt in laughter. Constantly. Poor guy just couldn't get through a lesson for 3 straight weeks. Got it too late. It caused a lot of stress when we found out we were using birth control pills wrong. The only thing I remember from sex ed which was taught by the creepy lunch lady. Lunch lady unrolls a condom and stretches it as far as she could. Then she says, "I know none of you are this big, so this will fit any of you." Double quote. My health teacher stuck her foot in her XL condom and pulled it halfway up her shin and then stared at the class and said, "If a guy ever tells any of you he's too big for condoms, you run as fast and as far as you can away from that." Double quote. My mom's the sex ed teacher. No context needed. Unintentional sex ed happened for me in 4th grade. In an assignment we had to invent a new town relating to the gold rush. I named it K-porn. And I thought I just made a new word, did not know what porn was. My imagination sucks and the town name was similar to a name I recently heard, K-porn. We had to give a reason for the name and my unimaginative mind said they didn't know why. A teacher parent conference later I was confused why they were asking me about the word porn and if I knew what it meant. Zero explanation on their end. So curiosity hits me and I Google porn. That's how my 4th grade teacher introduced me to online pornography and wanking. Edit. My first post comment that received some attention. Hope it was entertaining or you got a laugh out of it. Currently 25. Story from my mom. She taught a middle school special ed class. Her and a male colleague handled sex ed. Her first year on the job. They passed around a box so that students could write questions anonymously. The male teacher pulled a question and said he couldn't answer. Mom, wanting to be helpful, asked if it was a female question. The male teacher tried to warn her. The question was, "What does CM taste like?" My mom was so dedicated to educating these kids that she launched into a hypothetical discussion about how most body fluids have a high salt content. So it might take salty. The boy who wrote the question could not contain himself and blurted, "My girlfriend said IT tastes like gummy bears." Double quote. My mother never ate a gummy bear again. 2 interns were teaching us, 7th grade, about HIV. Interns. So, you can catch it by oral, vaginal and anal sex. That guy in the back. What about nasal sex? Double quote. Everybody. Shut up. Diego. Double quote. Interns. Well, the worst that could happen is dying by asphyxiation. Being singled out by the teacher because I had a unique name for a scenario along with a boy who I didn't like. She used our names in a scenario talking about how a relationship develops. We had to stand in front of the class while she described random scenarios where we might end up having unprotected sex. And why it was bad. I was not attracted to this boy. And I'm sure he wasn't attracted to me either. Hearing her talking about us having sex was nightmarish. One kid in my class asked if you could get STDs from having sex with a chicken. Kind of put him on the spot and was a little suspicious. More of a lack of sex ed horror story, and thankfully short. A guy who I had a crush on. Both of us seniors. pulled me aside one day and asks, "So when a girl has her period she just lays an egg in the toilet, right?" Double quote. I'll be honest. I'm not sure if I answered him or just stared at him. Not really a horror story. Rather a hilarious one. Catholic school sex ed, and they break up girls and guys into 2 rooms. A nun teaching the girls and a priest teaching the boys. Honestly probably more informative than my friends who went to public school. Taught about abstinence as well as condoms and whatnot. Anyways, the priest talks to us about masturbation and I'll never forget his line. Masturbation is perfectly normal. In fact 95% of men admit to doing it one time or the other. The other 5% are liars. Double quote. It was taught by a Jesuit monk whose English language skills were Latin, and by the end, 1 hour class total, I sometimes couldn't even identify which SX the diagrams were showing. It was all line diagrams. All medical terms. Close bracket. Father Bertoli thought it went well. Anyway. I'm reminded of the drawing in the sand scene from the movie Morris. Here is the vagina. And here the membrum virilis. Says the teacher. Morris. Looking on dubiously. I don't think I shall ever marry. Apostrophe. My friend's mom bought a sexual reproductive pop-up book. It covered both male and female. So you would open it up and the uterus and fallopian tubes would pop up at your face. You can only imagine the fun we had with that. Mine was basically, if you have SX you're gonna get diseases. Get pregnant and die. I was scared to have SX for a long time. Catholic middle school. In 8th grade they made us watch a video that was basically don't have SX or you'll die. The woman speaking in the video literally said she could tell if a girl has had SX or not by looking into her eyes and gazing into her spirit. Aside from basic biology and anatomy. That was the only formal SX ed that I received in school. That's horrifying. A friend of mine almost started puking during SX ed when we were watching a movie about childbirth in class. It wasn't very explicit but the blood was enough to get him as pale as the wall. Poor dude. Well, I didn't think it was a horror story. But it stunned a few people. When I was 5 and my sister was 6 we had a fish tank. One of the fish we had was a pregnant molly we liked quite a bit. Unfortunately she died before giving birth. So my sister, curious creature she is, asked our aunt, a trauma nurse who worked on Life Flight with a passion for teaching, if we could cut open the fish and save the babies. This would eventually lead first to my aunt dissecting the fish for us, then to her explaining reproduction, and ended with a rudimentary version of the talk. My aunt would take every chance she got to have a very graphic and factual discussion about SX and reproduction, so we would always be armed with knowledge and never have anything unknown. But it was in hindsight a bizarre way to get educated on the birds and the bees. A horror story in terms of education. In grade 9. We were given a paper that had an equation that said having safe, protected SX was equal to Satan. It went. Condoms and birth control lead to premarital SX, and SX without the intention of procreation. Premarital SX and SX without the intent to have children is a sin. Choosing to be sinful is the job of Satan. Condoms equals Satan. Needless to say we had a lot of pregnant girls in our graduating year. Not necessarily sex ed. But I worked with a couple who was dating and they didn't think they'd get pregnant because they didn't want to. For context. These are uber religious types, but apparently not religious enough lol, who assumed that God wanted them to be happy and wouldn't give them a child until after they were married. Huh. So they have a kid now. When I was in 3rd grade I convinced a bunch of my friends to ask when can I bust a fat nut just like that. On an index card. The questions were anonymous, so the teacher pulled about 4 index cards that just said when can I bust a fat nut in a row. 9th grade SX ed. Teacher got a wooden penis to show how to put on a condom and the condom ripped in front of everyone. And our teacher said, in my 27 years of living, I have never seen a condom rip, and someone in the back of class said, damn. Teacher be getting hella bitches, and he legit laughed nervously. We watched a video that tried to be hip and cool about SX ed and puberty. Direct quote. During puberty, a woman's hips and breasts grow. Double quote. Insert poorly done animation of a girl's hips and breasts enlarging to ridiculous sizes. No. Not that big. Double quote. We played STD in a cup. Everyone gets a cup of water. One cup of water has a bunch of dissolved starch in it, the STD. We went around swapping fluids to represent sex. And we're supposed to see if we could safely avoid STDs without protection, swapping fluids. At the end, we find out who had the STD by dropping iodine into each cup, turning the starch blue. If it turned blue, you tested positive. Everyone in the class ended up with the STD. Even me. Because even though I only had one partner, and they had only had one before me, the one before them was a sleuth and had everybody's fluids. Honestly, a very good exercise and warning. Except for that one kid. At the end, he dumped his test results and refilled his cup at the bubbler in order to claim he didn't have the STD. And he was good for more fluid swapping. Honestly, another good lesson on assholes who will lie about being clean. Use protection. Kids. Our sex ed teacher told us that girls who had sex before marriage were like chewed pieces of gum. I got that talk at church. I also remember a talk at church that said we, girls, were like pieces of tape and the more sex one had, outside of marriage, the less likely the relationship was to stick. The messages I got about sex make me so mad now. Looking back, they were so degrading and shaming. Probably 9 or 10 years old. Mid 1980s. Sex ed was taught at an after school event that lasted about a week. My mom and I and my best friend and her mom went. There were 2 rooms. Girls and their moms in one room and boys and their dads in the next room over. We learned basic stuff mostly about anatomy. Slides were shown. Probably dating from the 1950s. Awkward. Then at one point, the male teacher came over and asked for a few of the moms to come next door to help with something. My imagination went wild. Especially since my mom went with the man. I thought for sure that she and the other mom who went were being forced to show a live demo of what their boobs looked like or worse, even though I didn't know what worse was yet. They were in there for what seemed forever. What were they doing to our moms? How is my mom going to explain this to my dad when we get home? Why is nobody alarmed? Because they were moving desks. This isn't too much of a horror story but more of a moment that made me queasy. First, when discussing testicular cancer, they showed us a video of the skinny ginger guy in the shower feeling up his balls to check for tumors. Then they gave us this fake nutsack to pass around and feel. It was pretty lifelike and you could squeeze the balls and they'd kind of pop slide around the sack. All I could think of was doing that to my own sack and it just made me feel uneasy. The whole experience was just awful. My health teacher in high school told us condoms are strong and they are very stretchy. Don't believe any guy who goes I'm too big. It won't fit all this or it's just gonna break anyways. Why bother putting one on? She then produced 3 condoms available for pickup in the health office. Proceeded to pull one over her hand and up past her elbow on her arm like it was a fancy costume glove. Spread her fingers out as wide as they can go. Stretched 2 remaining of said condoms over her cowboy boots. And walked around non-stop for over 6 hours before one of them broke. Not necessarily a horror story. But that shit will haunt my dreams forever, Mayo. Bringing an actual dildo to demonstrate how to put a condom to a bunch of immature teenagers. We were actually given dildos to practice putting condoms on. It wasn't that big a deal. What was a big deal was that the woman who the school brought in to teach us proceeded to show us how to put a condom on with your mouth. When she came back 2 years later we reminded her of it and she said she got in trouble with her employers for that. But we asked her to do it again because it was funny and she eventually did. I grew up in the American South, where sex was such a taboo that the class wasn't allowed to be called sex ed. We had to call it your adult body. The class was completely about puberty and childbirth. Because any mention of sex was deemed too upsetting for young people. We learned that condoms and birth control was a thing. And the general idea of how it might work. But nothing else. We were never taught how to use a condom, how to get birth control, or how to know what an STD might look like. It wasn't surprising when we had a really high pregnancy rate in our school. I guess the true horror was being left unprepared. When I got to college, I fell in love and had sex for the first time. Due to being taught that anyone who has sex is dirty and less of a person, I had a lot of anxiety and felt like I would be abandoned. Sex ed shouldn't be abstinence only education. Had a teacher tell a group of 8th graders that if you have unprotected premarital sex that you would absolutely get an STD. Live the rest of your life in pain, then die and go to hell. God, I love the South. Grade 8 sex ed. Absolutely zero discussion of consent. Also grade 8 sex ed. Here are pictures of advanced STDs for you to enjoy. It was much later that I questioned how ethical it was to even show us those photos, as people with conditions that advanced probably had a host of other problems to deal with. Some of the diseases were so advanced that it was impossible to even tell what we were looking at. Not really a horror story. In high school sex ed, our teacher had a big section on condoms, which culminated with the class betting on how stretchy they were to prove that no one should accept the "I'm too big for them" excuse. Well, one air pump and one condom later, we had our answer at about the size of a long watermelon. As our teacher was going to try to pop it, to prove they tough, our principal was doing his rounds and opened the door. Saw our teacher smacking the shitty out of an inflated condom and just backed away slowly. I found it hilarious.